The sound never stops. That is the first thing you should understand about what happened to us in the mud fields of Calvaron Prime. Even now, sitting in this Medicae ward, with half my body wrapped in synth skin grafts and the other half held together by devotional studs, I hear it. The grinding, the mechanical stutter, the wet, heavy thump of the shell falling backward into the crew compartment instead of forward into the breach. They tell me the ringing will fade. The chirurgeons with their brass augmetic eyes and their incense-stained robes assure me that the auditory damage is temporary, that the machine spirits of my ears will heal with proper unguents and prayer. They are lying. I have been a tank crewman for 11 years, and I know what temporary sounds like. This is not temporary. This is the sound of Sergeant Vaughan's chest cavity collapsing under 70 kilograms of high explosive ordnance. This is the sound of the Emperor's own ammunition turning traitor in the belly of his holy war machine. I will tell you what happened. Not because anyone has asked me to, but because in 17 hours I will stand before a commissariat review board and explain why I am the only member of Hammer 77's crew still capable of speech. They will want to know about mechanical failure and crew negligence and proper maintenance rights. They will want someone to blame, because that is how the Imperium processes grief. Someone must have sinned. Someone must have failed in their devotion. The machine spirit does not err without cause, and cause requires a sinner. I suspect that sinner will be me, because I am the one still breathing, and the dead make poor defendants. We called her the Brass Widow. Not officially, of course. On the requisition scrolls and the maintenance logs and the kill tallies painted along her flanks, she was Vehicle Designation 77, Lehman Russ Battle Tank, Mars Pattern, attached to the 47th Calvaron Armored. But we loved her, and you do not love something without naming it. So she was the Brass Widow to us. Commander Hackle named her that after our third engagement, when the Lasfire and the Prometheum and the endless grinding advance through enemy lines had claimed his wife, his brother, his childhood friend from the Agri Collective, and every other human being he had ever cared about outside our hull. She makes widows of everyone, he said, running his calloused hand along the commander's hatch seal, but she keeps us alive while she does it. We laughed, because that is what you do when a man names his grief. You laugh, so he knows you understand. Huckle was a good commander. I need you to understand that before I tell you about how he died, because the review board will not care about goodness. They will care about maintenance schedules and ammunition inspection protocols and whether we said the proper litanies before loading. They will want to know if Hackle was negligent or incompetent or secretly corrupted by some influence I was too stupid to notice. He was none of those things. He was a 53-year-old man from an agri-world called Thessaly's Hope, a man who had survived 19 major engagements and held the Crimson Medallion of Valor and could field strip a Lascanon blindfolded while reciting the Litany of Accuracy. He was my commander for 6 years. He taught me how to read the sounds of the Brass Widow's engine, how to feel the subtle vibrations that meant her machine spirit was content versus the ones that meant something was wrong in the transmission housing. He taught me how to survive, which in the Imperial Guard is the only lesson that matters. He also taught me to listen for the autoloader's rhythm. That is the detail that will haunt me until whatever merciful death the Emperor grants me. Every crew member learns the sounds of their station, but Hackle made us learn all of them. You cannot serve a machine you do not understand, he would say, smoke curling from his low stick, while we ran through maintenance drills in whatever Emperor-forsaken staging ground we had been assigned to. You cannot love something whose voice you cannot hear. The autoloader had a voice, a mechanical pulse, that told you everything you needed to know if you knew how to listen. The whir of the ammunition carousel as it selected the next shell, the pneumatic hiss of the loading arm extending, the solid clunk of the shell seating into the breech, the satisfied mechanical sigh as the arm retracted and the carousel rotated to the next position. I knew that rhythm the way I knew my own heartbeat. I would hear it in my sleep, sometimes, during those brief moments of unconsciousness between engagements when the mind processes what the body has survived. Whir, hiss, clunk, sigh. Whir, hiss, clunk, sigh. On the morning of the engagement, the rhythm was wrong. I noticed it during our pre-dawn systems check, when the Brass Widow's crew compartment was still cold from the Calvaron night and our breath hung in clouds around the inspection lumens. Varn was running through the ammunition count, his thick fingers moving shells in the carousel, while I monitored the loading mechanism's response times. The whir was there. The hiss was there. But the clunk, the satisfying report of shell meeting breach, it was softer than it should have been. A fraction of a second too late. A degree or two off angle. Most crews would have missed it entirely, because most crews do not listen to their tanks the way Hackle taught us to listen. I almost missed it myself. The difference was so subtle that I had to cycle the loader 3 times before I was certain I was not imagining things. "Commander," I said. Hackle was topside, conferring with the squadron leader about our advance route, but he descended into the crew compartment when he heard the concern in my voice. I explained what I had heard. I demonstrated the delay. I asked him to listen to the clunk and tell me if I was losing my mind. He listened. 3 cycles. 4. 5. His expression never changed, because Hackle's face had forgotten how to show emotion somewhere around his 7th year of service, but I saw his fingers tighten on the viewport rim. "You are not wrong," he said. "Something in the alignment assembly. Half a degree, maybe less. We should report it. Request a mechanicus inspection before we advance." Hackle was silent for a long moment. Through the hull, I could hear the other tanks of our squadron warming their engines, the distinctive rumble of Lehman Russ power plants creating a symphony of violence preparing to be unleashed. "We deploy in 2 hours, he said. "The mechanicus inspectors are at Firebase Gamma, 3 days' march behind us. If we request inspection, we lose our position in the advance. Command will reassign us to reserve duties while we wait." He paused. "You know what happens to crews that get reassigned to reserve?" I knew. Reserve crews were the first to be cannibalized when frontline tanks needed replacement personnel. Reserve crews were the ones who got split up and scattered across a dozen different vehicles, losing the bonds that kept them alive. Reserve crews were crews that stopped being crews. So we advance anyway. We advance anyway. Hackle climbed back toward the commander's hatch, then paused. "The delay is less than 1/10 of a second, Corporal. The misalignment is less than a degree. In 11 years of service, I have seen autoloaders perform far worse and still function. We will run inspection rights between engagements. We will monitor closely. The Brass Widow has never failed us." He was right about that last part. 19 engagements. And she had never failed us. But machines, like men, have limits to their loyalty. We simply did not know we had reached hers. The advance began at dawn. I should describe the battlefield, because the review board will want tactical context, and because I want you to understand the circumstances before I tell you about the moment when everything changed. Calvaron Prime is what Imperial cartographers classify as a temperate agricultural world, which means it has weather that kills you slowly, instead of quickly, and soil that grows something other than corpses. Before the war, it grew grain, miles upon miles of grain, golden fields stretching to horizons so distant they seemed to curve with the planet's surface. The enemy, we were told, wanted those fields. The Imperium wanted them more, so we came to burn them. By the time our squadron advanced, there were no more golden fields. There was only mud. Mud churned by tank treads and artillery bombardment and the endless boots of infantry divisions that had passed through before us. Mud that swallowed men whole if they stepped wrong. Mud that stank of death, because it was death, composed as much of organic matter as mineral. The Brass Widow groaned through it, her treads churning grey-brown waves that splattered against the vision blocks and forced our driver, a young conscript named Dellen, to navigate by augur reading and prayer. Inside the crew compartment, the mud's presence was inescapable. It crept through every seal, every gap, every imperfection in the hull's integrity. It coated our boots and our hands and our equipment. It got into our ration packs and our water supplies and the action of Varn's autogun. Mud, I have learned, is the true enemy of armored warfare. Everything else is merely a symptom. We were 4 hours into the advance when we made contact with enemy forces. The first warning was the sound, because in a tank, the sound always comes first. A distant crump that could have been artillery or could have been an ammunition dump detonating or could have been anything at all, really, because war makes the same noises regardless of source. Then the Vox crackled with the squadron leader's voice, distorted by static and interference but clear enough to understand. Contact front, enemy armor, battalion strength, all units, weapons free. Hackle's response was immediate and automatic, the product of 19 engagements worth of muscle memory. Dellen, bearing 045, Varn, load standard anti-armor, Corporal, acquire targets. I pressed my face to the gunner's sight and saw hell. The enemy tanks were crude things, local manufacture based on stolen STC fragments that had been corrupted by isolation and desperation and whatever influences had turned this world against the Emperor's light. They were smaller than the Brass Widow, faster, but their armor was thin, and their guns were laughable by Imperial standards. On paper, we should have destroyed them without difficulty. In the mud of Calvaron Prime, with visibility reduced to a few hundred meters, and our tracks slipping on the churned earth, nothing was easy. I selected the closest target, a boxy vehicle with a turret that looked like it had been welded on by a blind man, and began the firing solution calculations. Behind me, I heard Varn cycle the autoloader. Whir, hiss, clunk, the shell seated, the breech closed. I squeezed the trigger. The Brass Widow's main gun roared, and somewhere in the grey murk ahead of us, an enemy tank ceased to exist. The recoil shuddered through the hull, familiar and almost comforting in its violence. Already the autoloader was cycling again, selecting the next shell from the carousel, preparing for the next kill. Whir, hiss, clunk. I fired again. Another enemy tank died. The battle settled into the rhythm I had known for 11 years, the rhythm of violence and survival that defined existence in the Imperial Guard. Acquire target. Wait for load confirmation. Fire. Acquire target. Wait for load confirmation. Fire. The mud and the smoke and the screaming metal faded into background noise, irrelevant compared to the immediate concerns of killing and not being killed. We destroyed 9 enemy vehicles in the first hour. The Brass Widow took 3 glancing hits that scarred her armor but failed to penetrate. Squadron 7-4 was less fortunate, their tank brewing up, when an enemy shell found their ammunition storage. We did not have time to mourn them. Mourning comes after survival, and survival required focus. By the second hour, the enemy advance had broken, their remaining vehicles retreating into the smoke, and the mud to regroup for another assault. The Vox crackled with orders to hold position and await infantry support. Hackle called for ammunition count and damage assessment. 73 shells remaining, Varn reported. No carousel jams, loading mechanism nominal. I wanted to believe him. Throne, I wanted to believe him so badly that I almost convinced myself the slight hesitation in the last few loads had been my imagination. But Hackle had taught me to listen, and I had listened, and I knew something was wrong. The clunk was softer now than it had been that morning. The delay was longer, perhaps 0.2 of a second instead of 1. The alignment was drifting. Commander, I said, the autoloader. I am still hearing the irregularity. I heard it too. Hackle's voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of a man calculating odds he did not like. Varn, visual inspection on the loading arm. Corporal, monitor the next 3 cycles manually. Dellen, keep us buttoned up and ready to move. We ran through the inspection while the battle paused to catch its breath around us. Varn, who was the largest member of our crew and the only one who could physically reach the autoloader mechanism without disassembling half the turret, squeezed himself into the cramped space between the breech and the carousel. I watched his face through the inspection lumens, watched him trace the loading arm's track with fingers that had loaded thousands of shells into the Brass Widow's hungry maw. There, he said finally. The alignment bearing. See how the arm is tracking? He pointed to a component I could barely see in the cramped darkness. It is supposed to seat flush against the breech rail. It is not sitting flush anymore. Gap of maybe 2 millimeters, but it is enough to throw off the shell's entry angle. Can you fix it? Not here, not with field tools. This is a manufactorum repair, needs a proper tech priest and a maintenance cradle. Vaughn's face was grim in the inspection lumens. I can try to compensate manually, time the loading sequence, guide the shell in by hand if it starts to drift. But if we get into sustained fire, if I cannot keep up with the cycle rate. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. We all knew what happened when an autoloader failed under combat conditions. At best, you got a jam that took precious seconds to clear while enemy shells pounded your hull. At worst, you got a shell that did not seat properly, that hung up on the breech rail and detonated from the gun's firing mechanism before it cleared the turret. Hackle made his decision in the space between heartbeats. We continue operations. Corporal, reduce rate of fire to half speed. Give Vaughn time to compensate manually. We stay with the squadron until this engagement is complete, then request maintenance priority at the forward depot. It was the wrong decision. I knew it was the wrong decision even as the words left his mouth. But he was my commander, and he had kept me alive for 6 years, and the alternative was abandoning our squadron in the middle of a contested advance. So I said, acknowledged, Commander. And we waited for the enemy to come again. They came at dusk. The second assault was worse than the first. The enemy had regrouped, reinforced, brought up heavier units with guns that could actually threaten the Brass Widow's armor. The Vox screamed with contact reports and casualty updates, and the desperate coordination of men trying to impose order on chaos. Our squadron was down to 6 tanks from the original 10. Firebase support was combat ineffective, their artillery crews wiped out by counter-battery fire. Infantry support was still 3 kilometers behind us, delayed by the mud and the bodies and the endless logistical nightmare of modern warfare. We were on our own. The first shell hit us amidships, a glancing blow that nevertheless rocked the Brass Widow like a child's toy and set my ears ringing. Contact, bearing 270, I shouted, already traversing the turret toward the source. Through the gunner's sight, I saw the enemy vehicle, a heavier design than the ones we had faced before, its gun already tracking toward us for a follow-up shot. Loading, Vaughn called. I heard the autoloader cycle. Whir. Hiss. The clunk never came. Instead, there was a grinding sound, metal on metal. The sound of something seizing in the darkness of the loading mechanism. Jam, Vaughn shouted. Shell is hung up on the breech rail. Working to clear. But we did not have time for him to clear it. Through the sight, I watched the enemy tank's guns stabilize, watched the muzzle flash that meant our death was racing toward us across the muddy field. Dellon saved us. Emperor bless his young soul. Dellon saved us. Without waiting for orders, he threw the Brass Widow into reverse, her treads screaming against the mud as we lurched backward just far enough for the enemy shell to pass through the space our hull had occupied a heartbeat before. The concussion still rocked us, close enough to taste, but we were alive. Jam cleared, Vaughn shouted. Reloading. Whir. Hiss. Clunk. The shell seated. I fired. The enemy tank died, but the jam had cost us precious seconds, and in those seconds the battle had shifted around us. Squadron 7-2 was gone, their wreck burning in the gathering darkness. 7-9 was mobility killed, their track blown off by a mine, their crew fighting from a stationary position that would soon become a coffin. The enemy was everywhere, their crude tanks pouring out of the smoke like vermin from a poisoned nest. Hackle's voice cut through the chaos, calling targets, coordinating fire, keeping us alive through sheer force of will and experience. Corporal, target bearing 185. Vaughn, load, and watch that alignment. I traversed the turret, acquired the target, waited for the load confirmation. Whir. Hiss. Grinding. Jam, Vaughn shouted. Thrown, damn it, jam. He threw himself at the loading mechanism, his massive frame wedging into the space beside the carousel with desperate strength. I could hear him wrestling with the shell, trying to force it into alignment, trying to save us from the death that was surely tracking toward our hull at that very moment. Outside, the enemy tanks closed. Hackle was shouting into the Vox, calling for fire support, for covering fire, for anything that might buy us the seconds we needed. Then the shell seated. Not correctly, not cleanly, but it seated, rammed into the breach by Varn's desperate strength, and the breach closed, and the mechanism cycled forward as if nothing was wrong. I did not think. I did not have time to think. The enemy tank was centered in my sight, its gun traversing toward us, and my finger squeezed the trigger because that is what fingers do when they have spent 11 years learning to kill. The gun fired. The shell did not leave the barrel. I learned later, in the Medicae ward, what happens when a high-explosive anti-tank shell detonates inside a gun breech. The round had seated crooked, its base misaligned by the fractions of degrees that our failing autoloader had introduced. When the firing mechanism ignited the propellant charge, the pressure found the path of least resistance, which was backward through the imperfect seal into the crew compartment, instead of forward through the barrel toward the enemy. The shell's warhead, designed to pierce tank armor and detonate inside enemy vehicles, performed exactly as intended. It simply performed inside our vehicle instead. The sound was indescribable. That is not a figure of speech. I literally cannot describe it, because my eardrums ruptured in the first microsecond, and everything after that was felt rather than heard. There was pressure, tremendous pressure, as if the hand of some angry god had reached into the crew compartment and squeezed. There was heat, searing and immediate, cooking the flesh on the left side of my face before I could even register pain. There was light, brilliant white light that burned my vision even through closed eyelids, and there was a sensation of my body becoming briefly weightless, lifted and thrown against the hull by forces that should have killed me but somehow, impossibly, did not. I do not know how long I was unconscious. Seconds, perhaps, minutes. When awareness returned, it came in fragments, like a shattered mirror, reflecting pieces of reality that did not quite fit together. I was lying on something wet and warm. The crew compartment was filled with smoke, thick and choking, illuminated by the orange glow of fires that should not have been possible inside a sealed tank. I could not hear anything except a high-pitched ringing that seemed to come from inside my skull. I tried to move and discovered that my left arm was not responding to commands, which seemed strange until I looked down and saw that it was no longer attached to my body in the conventional sense. Varn was directly in front of me. I say was, because what I saw was not Varn anymore, not in any way that mattered. The shell had detonated less than a meter from his position beside the breach. The blast had not killed him instantly, because the Emperor's mercy is not so clean, but it had taken everything below his ribcage and left the rest hanging from the loading mechanism like some grotesque trophy. His eyes were still open. His mouth was still moving, forming words I could not hear over the ringing. I watched his lips and tried to understand what he was saying, but blood was pouring from his mouth, faster than words could form, and after a moment his lips stopped moving, and his eyes stopped seeing, and Varn was gone. I turned my head, searching for Hackle, for Dellen, for anyone who might still be alive. The commander's position was buried under debris, twisted metal and shattered instruments, and the remnants of what had once been a human being. I could see Hackle's hand, still clutching the Vox handset, still trying to call for help even in death. Dellen's station was simply gone, the entire driver's compartment crushed by some catastrophic structural failure that had twisted the brass widow's hull like wet paper. I was alone in a metal coffin full of corpses, bleeding from wounds I could not count, and outside I could hear, I could feel, the impact of enemy shells striking our immobilized hull. The next hour is a blur. I remember crawling toward the emergency hatch, dragging my ruined arm behind me, leaving a trail of blood across the deck plates. I remember the hatch refusing to open, jammed by the hull deformation, and the desperate minutes I spent pounding against it with my remaining hand until something finally gave way. I remember the cold shock of the Calvaron night air hitting my burned face, the rain that had begun to fall while I was unconscious, washing the mud and the blood into rivers that ran down the Brass Widow's scarred armor. I remember enemy infantry, small figures in the darkness, advancing toward our wreck to finish what their tanks had started. I remember fire. Not from them. From us. From the other tanks of our squadron, the survivors who had seen the Brass Widow die and had formed a defensive line around her corpse. Las bolts and autocannon fire screaming over my head as I dragged myself out of the hatch, as I fell from the hull into the mud, as I lay there watching the light show and waiting for death that never came. Someone found me. I do not know who. Someone dragged me behind cover, applied a tourniquet to what remained of my arm, pumped me full of enough combat stimulants to keep my heart beating until the Medicaid teams could arrive. Someone saved my life, and I do not even know their name. The battle ended sometime before dawn. I was told later that we won, that the enemy broke and retreated, and that Calvaron Prime was secured for the Emperor. I was told that the 47th Calvaron Armored distinguished itself with honor, that our sacrifice had held the line during the critical hours when the infantry support was delayed, that medals and commendations would be distributed to the survivors. I was told that the Brass Widow's crew had performed their duty with exemplary courage, that Commander Hackle's name would be inscribed on the regimental memorial, along with Varn and Dellen and all the other dead, that their service to the Emperor would not be forgotten. I was also told, in hushed tones by a Medicaid orderly who thought I was too drugged to understand, that autoloader failures of the type that killed my crew had been reported in 17 other vehicles during the Calvaron campaign. 17 autoloaders, all from the same manufactorum, all displaying the same alignment defect that I had noticed during our pre-dawn inspection. The orderly did not know where she had heard this. She should not have told me. But drugs loosen tongues, and death makes people careless with secrets. And I lay in my cot and listened to the ringing in my ears and thought about what her words meant. 17 vehicles, 17 autoloaders, 17 crews who had reported irregularities, who had requested inspections, who had been told to continue operations because the advance could not wait. How many of them were dead now? How many had died the same way Varn died, trusting machines that had been built wrong from the start? The manufactorum, whoever they were, had produced defective equipment. The mechanicus, whose holy duty was to ensure machine purity, had approved it for deployment. Command, who received the reports and the requests and the warnings, had decided that the schedule mattered more than our lives. No one had sinned. Everyone had sinned. The machine spirit had not erred. It had simply been born broken, and the Imperium's vast machinery of war had ground forward regardless. I began to recover, if recovery is the right word for what happened to my body. The chirurgeons replaced my arm with an augmetic, a crude pneumatic assembly that wheezes and clicks and reminds me every moment of what I lost. The burns on my face healed into scars that tell their own story. My hearing returned, partially, enough to function, but never enough to forget the ringing that underlies every sound. I was moved from the Medicaid ward to a rehabilitation facility, then to a reintegration center, then to a holding barracks for personnel awaiting reassignment. It was in the holding barracks that I found the documentation. I should not have been able to find it. The files were classified, sealed by Mechanicus authority, stored in a cogitator archive that should have been inaccessible to a mere corporal awaiting reassignment. But the holding barracks shared infrastructure with the regimental headquarters, and someone had been careless with access protocols, and I had learned during my years in the Guard that bureaucratic systems have cracks just like armor does. You simply have to know where to look. The files detailed the Mars pattern autoloader defect. Not 17 vehicles. Not 20. Not 50. 643 vehicles deployed with the flawed alignment bearing across 7 different campaign theaters. The defect had been identified 18 months before the Calvaron campaign, flagged by a junior tech adept whose name had been redacted from the official record. The manufactorum had been notified. Production had been ordered to continue while a solution was developed, because the Imperium's need for tanks exceeded its tolerance for delay. The 643 vehicles had been distributed to frontline units, with a maintenance advisory attached to their requisition scrolls, a single paragraph noting that alignment irregularities may be observed under sustained fire conditions, and recommending enhanced monitoring and manual compensation as required. Enhanced monitoring. Manual compensation. The phrases burned in my mind like promethium. Someone had known. Someone had decided that warning us was enough. That a paragraph, buried in a requisition scroll, absolved them of responsibility for what came after. Someone had done the calculus of war, weighing tank production against crew survival, and had concluded that we were acceptable losses. I do not know what to do with this knowledge. I have thought about it during the long hours in my cot, listening to the ringing that never stops, watching the augmetic arm whir and click through its mechanical mockery of human motion. I have thought about showing the files to the review board, about demanding accountability, about screaming the truth until someone listens. But I know how this story ends. I have been in the Guard long enough to understand that there is no accountability, not for decisions made by those who outrank us, not for systems too vast for any one person to challenge. The manufactorum will continue producing tanks. The mechanicus will continue blessing them. Command will continue deploying them. And somewhere, right now, a tank crew is noticing a subtle hesitation in their autoloader's rhythm and being told to continue operations because the advance cannot wait. My review board convenes in 14 hours now. Less, actually. I have been writing this account through the night, trying to put words to what happened, trying to make sense of the senseless. They will ask me about mechanical failure and crew negligence and proper maintenance rights. They will want to know if Hackle was at fault for continuing operations despite the known defect. They will want to assign blame because that is what the Imperium does, and dead men make poor defendants. I have decided what I will tell them. I will tell them that Commander Hackle performed his duty with exemplary courage and dedication. I will tell them that Sergeant Varn and Driver Dellen died serving the Emperor with honor. I will tell them that the autoloader malfunction was unpredictable and unavoidable, a tragic accident that no amount of monitoring could have prevented. I will tell them everything they want to hear, every lie that will let them close the file and move on to the next review and the next death and the next acceptable loss. I will tell them these lies because the truth will not bring my crew back, because accountability is a luxury that enlisted men cannot afford, because somewhere in a manufactorum I will never see, workers are building another 643 tanks with the same flawed bearing, and nothing I say will stop them. Because the Imperium does not want to know what happens when the autoloader misfires mid-battle. The Imperium wants to believe that such things are accidents, sins, aberrations. The Imperium cannot afford to acknowledge that they are features of the system, inevitable consequences of a war machine that values production over precision and schedules over survival. But I am also going to do something else. There is a new assignment waiting for me after the review board concludes. I learned about it yesterday, when a staff officer visited my cot to inform me of my new duties. They are promoting me, if you can believe that, corporal to sergeant, with orders to report to a training facility on the other side of the planet. I am being assigned to instruct new tank crews in the operation and maintenance of Lehman Russ battle tanks. They want me to teach recruits what I learned in 11 years of service. They want me to pass on the knowledge that kept me alive when my crewmates died. At first, I thought this was punishment, a cruel joke at my expense, making the lone survivor train the next generation of acceptable losses. But the staff officer was sincere, even complimentary. She told me that my experience was valuable, that my survival demonstrated the kind of adaptability and resilience the Guard needed in its instructors. She told me that I would be shaping the future of armored warfare on this world and beyond. She did not seem to notice the bitterness in my laugh. I have thought about refusing, about telling them to find another broken veteran to train their cannon fodder, about taking my augmetic arm and my burned face and my ringing ears and disappearing into the vast anonymity of the Imperial labor pools. But I will not refuse. I cannot refuse, because if I refuse, those recruits will be taught by someone who does not know about the autoloader defect. Someone who will not tell them to listen for the subtle hesitation in the mechanism's rhythm. Someone who will send them into battle with machines they cannot trust and call it acceptable. So I will accept the promotion. I will stand in front of rows of young faces that remind me of Dellen, whose hope reminds me of the man I used to be before I learned what the brass widow could do to her children. And I will teach them everything Hackle taught me. I will teach them to listen to their tanks, to feel the vibrations that mean something is wrong, to trust their instincts when the machine spirit speaks to them. I will teach them about the autoloader, about the alignment bearing, about the rhythm that tells you whether your next shot will kill the enemy or yourself. I will teach them what the Imperium will not, because the dead have given me knowledge that the living need. The files I found in the Cogitator archive, the documentation of the defect, and the cover-up, and the 643 vehicles sent to war with death sleeping in their mechanisms. I have made copies. I cannot take them to the review board. I cannot take them to the commissariat. I cannot take them to anyone with the authority to change things, because authority and change do not coexist in the Imperium. But I can take them to my training facility. I can incorporate them into my curriculum, my unofficial curriculum, the lessons I teach between the official lessons about loading procedures and targeting solutions and proper genuflection before the machine spirit. I will create a generation of tank crews who know what I know, who listen like I listen, who understand that the machines they serve are fallible, that the institutions that deploy them are indifferent, that their survival depends on knowledge the Imperium would rather they not have. I cannot save Varn or Hackle or Dellen. I cannot change the system that killed them. But I can arm the next wave of acceptable losses with something the Manufactorum cannot take away, and the Mechanicus cannot classify, and Command cannot bury in a requisition scroll. I can give them the truth. It is morning now. The ringing in my ears has not faded, but I have grown used to it, the way you grow used to any constant presence. In 3 hours, I will stand before the review board and lie with perfect conviction. In 3 weeks, I will report to my new posting and begin teaching young men and women how to die slightly less often than they otherwise would. In 3 months, or 3 years, or 3 decades, one of those young men and women will notice a subtle hesitation in their autoloader's rhythm, and they will remember what I taught them, and they will know what it means. That will have to be enough. In the Imperium of Man, that will have to be enough. I can hear the orderlies in the corridor now, preparing to escort me to the review chamber. I should finish this account and hide it somewhere safe, somewhere it might survive me if the board decides that lies are not enough and that someone must still be blamed. But before I go, I want to record one final detail, one thing I have not told anyone else, and probably never will. In the moment when the shell detonated, in that fraction of a second when the fire was burning my face, and the pressure was crushing my chest, and Varn's blood was painting the crew compartment in abstract patterns of red, I heard something. Not through my ears, which were already destroyed, but somewhere deeper, somewhere inside me. I heard the brass widow's machine spirit screaming. It was not rage. It was not malfunction. It was grief. She had loved us, I think. In whatever way a machine spirit can love, she had loved us. She had carried us through 19 engagements, had taken shell after shell against her armor to keep us safe, had growled her way through mud and fire and the endless violence of Imperial warfare because we were her crew and she was our home. When the autoloader failed, when the shell took the wrong path and murdered the men who had cared for her for years, she felt it. She grieved for us. In that last moment before the flames and the pain and the long silence of unconsciousness, I do not know if this makes what happened better or worse. I do not know if machine spirits truly feel, or if I was simply hallucinating from blood loss and shock. But I know what I heard, and I know what it meant to me, and I know that somewhere in the wreckage of the Brass Widow's corpse, buried in the mud of Calvaron Prime, there is a consciousness that mourns my crewmates as truly as I do. Perhaps that is the real lesson I will teach my recruits, not just how to listen to their tanks, but how to love them, how to understand that the machines they serve are not mere tools but partners, spirits bound in metal and ceramic, alive in ways the Imperium's cold theology cannot acknowledge, how to forgive them when they fail, because failure is not betrayal when the system itself is broken. The orderlies are at my door. I must go. Emperor, protect the crews of the 47th Calvaron Armored, the living and the dead. Emperor, protect the young fools I will soon be teaching to survive. Emperor, protect the brass widows of every regiment, the tanks who carry their crews into hell and grieve when they cannot carry them out again. And Emperor, forgive the manufactorums, and the tech priests, and the commanders who knew, and decided that production mattered more than precision, who knew and decided that we were acceptable. We were never acceptable. We were never losses to be calculated. We were Huckle and Varn and Dellen and me, human beings who trusted machines and institutions and each other, who believed that our service meant something, who died or survived in a metal coffin while the Imperium ground forward regardless. The autoloader still misfires, somewhere. Right now, as I walk toward my judgment, some crew is hearing that hesitation, that subtle wrongness in the rhythm, and they are deciding whether to report it or continue operations. I pray they report it. I pray they refuse to advance. I pray they choose survival over schedule, precision over production, their lives over the Imperium's endless hunger. But I have been in the Guard for 11 years, and I know how this story ends. Whir, hiss, silence.